Renaissance Gallery in West Concord, and we're having some time to video our work. We have a lot of visitors coming in and out. It's really exciting. But I'm going to talk to Meryl right now because she has this new work on paper that I haven't really seen before. Want to talk about it?
Yes, thanks, Rody. Yeah, I'm really known for my textiles, but I've been having so much fun with paper. I started out using ephemera, and that's very consistent with the way that I use old fabrics and I compost fabrics and so forth. Like my textile work, I am also bringing in like imagery from nature and things like that. And one of the other things that I've been exploring is I have wakefulness in the middle of the night, and in the middle of the night I use these different mechanisms to try to calm myself down and to comfort myself. And one of them is to imagine myself very, very, very small within the garden. This is an example too of what my mind is doing in the middle of the night, where there's the comfort of the leaves, but there's also like the tangle of anxiety or the complexity of how we plan our lives and what have we gotten to and what haven't we. And then this idea of the ghost-like imagery or what it is from the past that's affecting our subconscious.
Like, what attracts you to these devices or techniques to put together your imagery?
Well, one of the things that I really love are actually the formal elements. So I love playing with color. I love playing with space and sort of confusing the confusion of, even when you're half awake, half asleep, the confusion of what comes forward and what recedes. And then the idea of line and different kinds of line and value as well. Value, light and dark, and so what is coming forward and what is receding. And then also just whether or not you use color or not.
Yeah.
So some of these are handmade papers that I made years ago. Sometimes I use the mechanism of stenciling. I make these stencils based on the flora that I observe. And then when I stencil them, they become graphic and flat. So what does it mean to mold an object versus to symbolize it?
With that by breaking, this is an applique collaged line, and the stamp is right on the paper, but you interrupted it to kind of play on that sort of, tricking the eye more or less.
So I'm having a ball.
Oh,
I'm having so much fun with this. And there are more on the boards back in the studio.
Yeah, and I sense a very meaningful narrative going on here. Are you trying to document history or let it go?
Love that question. This particular piece was done in grief. And my grief on the loss of my mother was different than a lot of people's grief in losing their mother, because I had such a difficult relationship with her that there was also a little bit of relief. It's a very complex thing. It's something that it's hard to know how much of that to expose, even how acceptable is that to even say out loud. So I'm sure when I started this, I had no idea that it would ever be shown, but it actually has been shown a lot and very much appreciated. My impulse to make things really is an impulse to connect with other people who have had similar experiences. And that's what it's helpful in your process of grief, to not be all by yourself in your experience. I thought a lot about the past and history, and there are elements of toile and the imagery of this toile that specifically refer to things in my family. But so the toile went into my compost bin and was composted over time, but then I laundered it and I reordered the illustrations to create a new narrative.
You're using embroidery, which is considered a traditional technique, but not in the precious way, more as a mark making.
And I would say emotional expression.
Yeah.
The stitching to me is very much links me through the years of women, including the women in my own family. The fact that we stitch on both sides of both grandmothers. And at the same time, I am making a statement about mess. All the tails that are used, they're not hidden within the back. The knots are obvious, the tails come out in the front. And I was thinking, I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to tell more of the truth. And so the tails are the tails and the mess of life coming out. I'm not hiding my way of making, my way of constructing on the back.
sculpture that was on exhibit at Boston Sculptures Gallery. While building it, it was created with these doilies that I had to dye black. There was so much agency in these objects, and the women who made them are totally forgotten.
Well, a lot of history, right? I mean,
Yeah. See, I'm very interested in all kinds of traditional handwork techniques, how they work, the mechanisms. But then I like to deconstruct them and make them my own, and always with an eye on the history of where they came from and why, and the context of the world
right.
of these women.
What's interesting and I find compelling about these two is the scale change.
I want to sort of project them as very large presences, embodiments of these women. Whoever made this now has a voice.
I'm wondering, can you also just tell us, like, I'm so curious, I find this very compelling, about how you make them.
It's a full body experience. I like to trace the general shape of the doily, and then I hang the image next to it and go into it with charcoal, graphite sometimes, oil paper, which is indestructible. And that's the secret to this, because to get these blacks, I rub and really infiltrate the charcoal into the pulp of the paper. And I have to use rubber-lined gardening gloves to do the rubbing. And I wore holes through 3 pairs to get this done.
I mean, that's a tie-in on labor.
Yes,
You know, the
exactly.
labor of making the doily, the labor of representing the doily. And I would say too, the fact that you have it in front of you and you're doing this process of translating something with history in a contemporary way. Can you tell me a little bit about this one too? Was this a similar process for you?
I used a lot more water on a brush with this one to get those washes.
You know, I do think it's interesting too. We both work in textiles, and the sensual pleasure of textiles, and the body experience of working with textiles. And yet, we also find that we have a voice that is in paint or drawing. Which is interesting to me that the medium lends itself to some of the same explorations.
Yet, I consider this a very tactile medium. This doesn't take up a different space in my head than my fiber work. For that reason,
it's a bonus. It's an added way of expressing or experiencing the same thing. Julie, this series called An Unidentified Woman is fascinating to me, and I'm really interested in this combination of this, what I think is a historic photo, and this contemporary embroidery that goes over it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, these are tintypes that were found at flea markets, yard sales, things like that. It was inspired by an exhibit I had at Historic Northampton where they asked me to respond to their collections. I was responding to something else and came across their daguerreotypes. And in the catalogs, all the men had every single detail of their life listed, which was great. Where they were born, who were their parents, who they married, where they worked. And about 75 to 80% of the women had the title Unidentified Woman.
Wow.
So that really struck me how little importance these women's lives had for historians back then.
Right.
Because this is like late 19th century. I am using embroidery sort of as a feminist act to express an identity, to give them a new life.
I'm wondering too, if when you're working, do you imagine the life and then you, whatever the imagery is that you're applying on top has something to do with that person coming alive for you? Or is it more formal elements?
No, I spend time with each image before I do anything, and I even sketch with tissue paper quite a bit. And I try to pull out a characteristic of them that I find compelling. For instance, with this one, her buttons are the stem. And then this crazy flower on top reveals her looking out from behind, like she's a wallflower. You know, she's here, but no one knows it.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, she sees, we might not see her, but she sees us, you know,
Mhm.
that sort of thing.
Can you tell me about the keyhole?
Yes, this was is an image of a very young girl, you know, maybe about 10 years old, and the grimace.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like she was trapped.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Although they're embellished, they're still not identified. You know,
Exactly.
you're pulling out a story, but it's not necessarily a historic story or having to do with someone's name.
No,
or,
this
know.
is all the imagination.
Right, right,
Yeah.
which is what we're left with
Yeah.
about these lives.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And yet you're honoring them by embellishing them in these beautiful ways.
Absolutely.
Yes, I was asked actually to do a self-portrait. You know, I have a lot of different identities, but one of my identities is as a mother. And as you know, Jody, I actually am really interested in sort of the history of women. And so thinking about the roles that women play throughout the history of their family is something that's interesting to me. So this dress was actually given to me by a colleague, and I liked that as my self-portrait because I wanted a little bit of distance from this topic of being a mother in a way that you want to have your children feel like you're not ever present and a heavy hand on their lives.
I'm really interested in the words that are embroidered, what is like the narrative here, like how you're able to take this visual object and evoke all sorts of emotions, imaginations.
Oh, I'm glad you feel that way. I'm glad that's a great question and a great way to engage with the piece. You know, my impulse as an artist is to start from the self, an autobiographical narrative, but it's an impulse that is the wish to connect to other people around common experiences or common challenges. So in doing my self-portrait as a mother, I'm also thinking about other people's experience as a mother and my mother and my children. So I'm also thinking about the issues around gender identification, biological sex versus what one feels one is. And so that's also all worked into here.
So the red dress, if we're talking about gender,
Mhm.
what?
So I have two children who were born biologically female, and one of my adult children identifies as non-binary. That's why I incorporated the word they into the title, because that's a really big thing for us to learn how to do. One of the other stories that's being told here is the way that we mother is impacted about how we were mothered.
What were your decisions in conveying that sort of dichotomy?
So it was both conveying that dichotomy and also what do we tell and what do we obscure. So my narratives are autobiographical, but I want them to be imaginary enough that another person can relate to them. So on the inside of the dress, I wrote all the things that I wished I had received from my mother on little pieces of ripped up grocery bags. But they're written and obscured, and they're stitched into the garment on the inside, because that's what I carry forward, but I don't want it to be too strong of a narrative and too much dominating. On the outside, I will tell you, I walked into becoming a mother with great trepidation and ambivalence. I desired my children very much. They were very wanted. But I was worried about repeating patterns from my own background. So I did an enormous amount of sort of reading about language development or the brain development and age-appropriate behavior. And I went to a lot of workshops that would help me, create an environment that would be a healthy environment for my children. So written on the outside are all the things that I really hoped to bring to mothering.
The
All the ways,
affirmative.
yes, that I wanted to be a mother. And so, it says, promote healthy sexual expression, which is just a continuation of the conversation we've been having. Don't compare. Go to their sports events. Minimal, my family.